Hi, everyone. With the STAAR test coming up these upcoming weeks, I wanted to present this slideshow that I put together, Think Like a Test Writer. So this is a series that I'm creating, and then I'll be creating these based on various different standardized tests, the SAT, the ACT, the AP tests. But I wanted to start by tackling the STAAR test. For a little bit of background, I taught for 10 years in the public school classroom, specifically in STAAR tested subjects. Um, so I have acquired all of this knowledge and picked up on some various patterns over the years on what the STAAR graders, or the STAAR writers rather, what they will throw at you. So I wanted to offer this. Now, this particular session is focused on reading and informational text. So in the future, I will make more on the other sections of the test, but I think that reading and informational text is a particular part of the test that can be rather difficult. So, to begin, before we dive into the questions, I want to propose this analogy. Have you ever played a game of chess? If so, you might already know that chess is a game that means thinking like your opponent, predicting their next move, and basing your decisions on the knowledge of how they are going to try to trick you. Taking a standardized test like STAAR kind of works the same way. The test writers tend to have the same types of wrong answers that they throw on each type of test question. Being able to predict how they are going to try to trick you can help you find the right answer to the question. So this is the approach that I take, in that we are going to examine the test questions and the pattern in which these are the types of wrong answers. Because if you can identify the wrong answers, if you can be 2 steps ahead of them, then you can eliminate those answers right away. And it makes you that much closer to passing the test. So on the next slides, we're going to look at a passage and questions from our released copy of the 2023 English I test so you can see for yourself. And by the way, this slideshow is going to be on my Teachers Pay Teachers store. So if you want to have, if you're a teacher and you want to have these pages as a handout to give to your students, then this is something that you can purchase off my Teachers Pay Teachers store. I'll put the link in the description. So big thing, make sure to read each passage before looking at the test questions. Not reading the passage can make you guaranteed to get some questions wrong. And we're trying to beat this thing. And they are depending on students to not read the test questions. And some of the test questions are written that way. So you'll see that in a minute. So this one is over an informational passage, and this is an informational passage that came from the Digital STAAR of 2023 that was released. And so sometimes people say pause the video and read this on your own, but I think it's really helpful when we read it together. Sometimes hearing it read out loud can make things click a little better. And I always encourage my students to read out loud in your head. Obviously, you can't read out loud in the testing room. That would be a distraction. They don't like that. But you can read out loud in your head. Be intentional with your reading, or you can hear your voice in your head reading. But I'm going to read this out loud. And if you don't want to hear me read out loud, just fast forward this part and you can go on to the next slide. So just by eyeballing this without even reading it, we can tell that this is an informational text about the city of Venice, Italy. Right here, point out these numbers where that arrow is. Those numbers represent the paragraph number, and that's going to be important because many of the questions will reference you to look back at different paragraph numbers, and we'll see that in a minute. So let's read this passage. Keeping the city of Venice afloat. Instead of car-filled streets, the city of Venice in Italy has a system of winding canals. Tourists flock to Venice to float through the city on its iconic gondolas. People gather for conversation and coffee in cafe-filled squares reached by hundreds of pedestrian bridges that cross the canals. Ornate 14th and 15th century palaces filled with treasures of art line the waterways. The city is among the world's most beautiful. Sometimes called the floating city, Venice is designated a World Heritage Site by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, better known as UNESCO. As described by UNESCO, Venice is an extraordinary architectural masterpiece in which even the smallest building contains works by some of the world's greatest artists. But today, this treasured city faces a challenge to its very existence, a challenge that scientists and engineers are determined to meet head on. From marsh to masterpiece. The history of Venice is intertwined with its geography. After the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, invaders surged into what is now northern Italy. Locals on the mainland needed to escape. Just off the shore of the Italian peninsula was a saltwater marsh dotted with 118 small islands separated by twisting, shallow channels. The islands had long been used by fishermen, but were inhospitable and mostly uninhabited. The locals fled to these islands, while waves of invaders burned and looted the cities on the mainland. Although many of the refugees eventually returned to the mainland, some people remained on the islands. A lagoon and narrow strip of sand separated the marsh from the ocean and offered protection from the sea, as well as access to it. The early Venetians drained parts of the marsh and turned the channels into canals. Because the weak slit and sand of the islands would not support large buildings, the Venetians created foundations embedded not in the silt, but in the stronger clay beneath. Using logs shipped from forests of nearby Montenegro, they created stakes as long as 60 feet. Then they pounded these stakes through the silt into the stiff, solid clay. That is a tongue twister for you. Their method of pounding was similar in principle to modern pile drivers. Using pulleys, the builders hoisted a heavy weight into position above the stake or post and then let it drop. Foot by foot, the stake was pounded into place. Once all the stakes were in place, wooden platforms were built on top. Buildings, many made of marble, were constructed on the platforms. How many wooden stakes hold Venice up? They are countless. For example, when just one building, the Santa Maria della Salute Church, was built in the 1600s, over 1 million wooden stakes were reportedly used in its foundation. Venice's natural strategic position on the sea, along with its special design, helped make it a wealthy city. It became a center for trade with a flourishing merchant shipbuilding industry. Numerous stately palaces and magnificent churches were built atop the city's unusual foundation. By the 14th century, Venice was a marvel of architecture and a magnet for Renaissance arts. Trade, traffic, and culture flowed along an intricate network of canals. The centerpiece was the S-shaped Grand Canal, which served, as it still does, as Venice's main boulevard, which had once been a lowly marsh. What had once been a lowly marsh had become a masterpiece of urban development and an example of how humans can depend on, benefit from, and modify the natural environment at the same time. Pause real quick to pay attention to these section headings. This is the second section heading we have had, and they are important to indicate the organizational structure. We'll talk about that more in a minute, of the passage, and sometimes the questions refer to these section headings. Though Venice is no longer the world power of trade and wealth, it was 5 centuries ago. Its fantastic architecture and wooden foundations remain marvelously intact. Why hasn't the wood rotted after all these years? First, microorganisms that rot wood can survive only in the presence of both air and water. The posts, buried in sediment, are not exposed to air. Second, over the years, tides have carried silt and sand that have permeated the wooden pilings, turning them into something akin to stone. Those ancient pilings still provide firm support for Venice's beautiful buildings, which in turn support Venice's tourist industry. The city remains a vibrant maze of at least 150 canals, more than 400 bridges, and somewhere beneath it all, 118 islands. Even so, Venice's natural turned urban setting has special challenges. Starting in about the 1920s, people drilled wells under Venice for drinking water. To do that, they tapped into freshwater aquifers beneath the hard clay. As water was pumped out, the clay began to settle. So did parts of Venice. This settling caused the lower parts of the city to sink and flood. In the 1960s, drilling and pumping were halted to prevent any further settling. Today, Venice faces a second flooding challenge. The same lagoon that protects the city now frequently floods it because of the rising sea level. When tides rise high, people must pick their way on raised platforms across Venice's famous St. Mark's Square, a particularly low area of the city. To combat the tidal rise, engineers have created a system they call mows to keep the city above water. After decades of design and planning, they installed floodgates on the seafloor at the four entrances of Venice's lagoon. When high tides are predicted, the gates hinge up, blocking the tide. In October 2020, mows successfully protected Venice from high tides for the first time. 78 bright yellow barriers rose to keep the water out. The city's mayor, Luigi Brugnaro, told reporters, "Today, everything is dry. We stopped the sea." And here is a picture of the mow system in Venice, Italy. Always pay attention to the visual aids. They'll help you with comprehension of the passage. Once again, we can look to Venice to learn how humans can balance technology, nature, and urban landscapes. Thanks to mows, Venice is staying dry. With its rich history, amazing architecture, and priceless art, the city of gondolas and canals will be enjoyed by many future generations. So I know that STAAR passages are supposed to be, forgettable, but I actually learned a lot about the city of Venice and the history from this passage. So if you can reframe your mind, when you read these passages, maybe learn something from them that's interesting, that, separate it from a standardized test and the thought that I have to take this test, and try to get some interesting information out of it. It can't hurt, because there was some cool information in here about the history of Venice. But let's go on to the questions. So there are going to be 8 questions associated with this passage, and here is the first one. So on each of these slides, what we're going to do is first break down the question before we get to the slide that contains the answer. And as we do this, our goal is to think like a STAAR test writer. Because as I said in the beginning, the STAAR test writers, these human writers, and think of it that way, these people are human, just like you taking this test. They're not super intelligence or anything like that. They're human, right? And they have a pattern with how they write the questions and how they write the wrong answers. There's a pattern to how they try to trick you. So if we can identify that pattern of how they are going to try to trick you, then it makes it that much easier to eliminate answer choices, and then that much easier to arrive at the correct answer. So let's look at number 1. Read this quotation from paragraph 5. And quotation is just a fancy word that means quote. You probably heard your English teacher say a quote or text evidence 1,000 times. That's what they mean. So here's a quote from paragraph 5. Their method of pounding was similar in principle to modern pile drivers. Using pulleys, the builders hoisted a heavy weight into position above the stake or post and then let it drop. Foot by foot, the stake was pounded into place. Okay, so here's our quote. Now, what's the question? What are they asking us about this quote? The author includes this information most likely in order to. So before we look at the answer choices, notice that I've highlighted the author and most likely. So questions worded this way are asking you to analyze the author's purpose. That's one of the standards that the state of Texas says that students in the 9th grade have to learn, to analyze the author's purpose. In other words, what that means is, what was the author hoping to accomplish? When the author wrote these words, and remember, this article was not written for the STAAR test. This article was written separate, and the STAAR test writers decided to take this article and put it in the test. So with that in mind, when the author wrote this quote, why? What was the author hoping to accomplish? So let's see if we can discover the right answer. The author includes this information most likely in order to A, contradict the assumption that early inhabitants of Venice were unskilled. B, illustrate the unique building method in a way people today can understand. C, explain the importance of wooden stakes and building a secure foundation. D, support the key idea that Venice was a wealthy city with many grand palaces. So if you need to pause the video here, review the answer choices, and even go backwards, rewind in this video and look at the passage, you can do that. But then just come back to this place in the video, and then we'll go through and examine the answer and why the correct answer is the correct answer and why the wrong answers are wrong. Okay, so the correct answer is B. This is an informational text, meaning that the author's purpose is to explain something to the reader. It makes sense that the author would use a modern, relatable example to help explain an old-timey building method. So if you look at B, the correct answer, illustrate the unique building method in a way people today can understand. So first, let's back up and let's review the quote that they gave us. Right up at the top, right underneath that arrow. This is the quote that the question is focusing on. Any correct answer choice has to align with this quote. And this is how they try to trick you. One way they try to trick you on these types of questions, the types of questions that give you a quote in a box and ask you to focus on that quote in the box. One way they try to trick you is by giving you an answer choice that is true according to the passage, but it doesn't have anything to do with the quote. So you as the test taker, you see this answer choice and you think, well, that's true. I remember reading that in the passage, but does it have anything to do with the quote in the box? Because that's what you're supposed to be focusing on. Let's look at answer choice D. D is incorrect. Support the key idea that Venice was a wealthy city with many grand palaces. D is incorrect because even though the passage does talk about grand palaces elsewhere, this particular quote is unrelated to that. It does say that in the passage, but it's not connected to the quote that they gave us. And the question was, why did the author include this quote? So you want to eliminate answer choices that have nothing to do with what they're asking, nothing to do with that quote in the box. Okay, so the correct answer here is B. Let's move on to question 2. And here we have another question about a quotation, fancy word for quote. Are you sensing a pattern? Remember all those times your English teacher told you that you have to have text evidence to support your answer, to the point that those words, you just became numb to them because you heard them all the time. Text evidence, quote, text evidence, quote. That's why your English teacher kept repeating those, because that's what you're going to be tested on. These questions are testing your ability to use evidence from the text, also known as a quote, to support or prove your answer. So in the other question, we had a quote in a box, and we had questions about why that quote was used. This one flips it. Which quote best supports the thesis of the article? And our answer choices are a series of quotes from the article, from various places in the article. A, Venice's natural strategic position on the sea, along with its special design, helped to make it a wealthy city, paragraph 7. B, the centerpiece was the S-shaped Grand Canal, which served, as it still does, as Venice's main boulevard, paragraph 8. C, what had once been a lowly marsh had become a masterpiece of urban development and an example of how humans can depend on, benefit from, and modify the natural environment at the same time, paragraph 8. Those ancient pilings still provide firm support for Venice's beautiful buildings, which in turn support Venice's tourist industry, paragraph 10. So this question is not only testing your ability to understand the relationship between text evidence and the importance of text evidence. This question is also testing your understanding on what is a thesis. That's another word that you probably heard all the time in English class. And that's why we need to make sure that we know what that word means when we get to the test. So to put simply, the thesis is the main point or main idea of the text. So what is the main idea of the text? Is the first question we have to ask ourselves. And then, which of these quotes best supports that thesis? Best backs it up? Best gives it credibility? If you want, take this time to pause the video, see if you can figure out the right answer, unpause, and then we'll go to the next slide. Which quotation best supports the thesis of the article? The correct answer is C. What had once been a lowly marsh had become a masterpiece of urban development and an example of how humans can depend on, benefit from, and modify the natural environment at the same time. That is paragraph 8. So this question is a good example of why it is important to read the whole passage. I can't tell you how many students admit after the fact, I didn't read the passage, I just skimmed, or I might have fallen asleep during the passage, and I get it. The STAAR test is boring. The passages are often not what you would read on your free time, but the graders and the writers of this test, they are depending on some students not reading the passage, and that's the purpose of questions like this. Because all of the options, A, B, C, and D, all of the options are quotes from the passage. And they all have something to do with Venice. Without reading the entire thing, you won't know what the main idea or the thesis of the whole passage is. Because to say that the thesis is Venice, that's not accurate. The topic is Venice, but the thesis is the main point, the main idea, the main focus. And that's what the test writers are banking on, that some people will not read the whole passage and therefore will have no idea what the thesis is. But if you did read the whole article, then you probably picked up on the thesis. Answer choice A, B, and D are all incorrect because they all represent just a part of the passage. They are supporting details of the thesis, but only C covers the big idea of the whole passage. So sometimes you'll have questions that will ask you about the whole passage, and the wrong answer choices will focus on just a part of the passage. And then other times it's the opposite, which is what we saw in that one question where you had the quote in the box, question 1. They're focusing on just a part of the passage, and you'll have wrong answer choices because those wrong answer choices are focusing on something totally elsewhere in the passage. So that should be the first question you ask when you read a test question. Is this asking me about the whole passage? And to look at it as a bigger piece. Or is this question asking me to just look at one quote or one part of the passage? In this case, we are supposed to look at the whole passage. A, B, and D only focus on a part of the passage. All right, let's go on to 3. Oh, joy. Another question where they want us to read the author's mind. We love these, right? And that was a little bit of verbal irony for you, because verbal irony is sarcastic. And we're being sarcastic because author's purpose questions are the worst. And statistically, I say that because statistically students score the lowest on questions involving author's purpose. Because we are essentially being asked to read the author's mind, and all we have to go on to read the author's mind about why the author made the decision that he or she did, all we have is the text. Okay, so now we have to put our skills in using text evidence to support our point to use. But that's hard. But we can do it, but it's hard. Okay, so remember those section titles we pointed out when we were reading the passage. Those ones I had the arrow and I said, remember these section titles help with organization. This is testing your ability to understand text structure. So this question is testing not only author's purpose, but your ability to understand text structure. And what is text structure? It's just a fancy academic way of saying how the paragraphs are organized and why. Why did the author choose to put this paragraph here and this paragraph here? Why did the author organize this essay the way that he or she did? So here's the question. What is the most likely reason the author organizes the sections from Marsh to Masterpiece and Then and Now using comparison? Okay, so we're going to have to go back in the passage to really break down what was going on in each of those sections, and we're going to do that. But first, let's read our answer choices so they're in the back of our mind. A, to emphasize Venice's transformation and the many challenges it has overcome over time. B, to entertain the reader with the dramatic story of Venice's founding and the people who inhabit the city today. C, to inform the reader about historical developments in engineering and urban planning that work effectively with nature. D, to discuss the historical significance of the city and place it in a larger context. Okay, so go ahead, pause the video, see if you can answer this question before we go to the next slide. You will probably, and by probably I mean definitely, need to refer back to the passage, especially for this type of question. So feel free to scroll backwards, or as we used to say, rewind in the video, and then look over the passage, and then come back to the spot in the video, and we'll go to the next slide and reveal that answer. The correct answer is A, to emphasize Venice's transformation and the many challenges it has overcome over time. Wait, I thought the answer would be C, because the purpose of this passage is to inform. That's what we talked about, isn't it? Besides, it mentions work effectively with nature, and that's word for word from the passage. And that's where they get you. So yes, the purpose of this passage is to inform. So as a result, you might be inclined to choose that answer as soon as you see that word inform. This is an informational passage. Here's the word inform. Better pick that answer. That's what they want you to think. You might also want to choose C, not only because it uses the word inform, but because it uses wording from the passage. It talks about that stuff about nature that is straight from the passage. Seems legit. But be careful, because the question isn't asking about the whole passage. It's asking about the purpose of the comparison being made in those two sections. And that's why it's so important to understand, what is the question asking? Is it asking you to focus on the whole passage? Or is it asking you to focus on a specific part of the passage? The question, let's reread it. What is most likely the reason the author organizes the sections from Marsh to Masterpiece, and then and now, using comparison? Okay, that's what we need to focus on. Why is that comparison taking place in those two sections? And C focuses on the whole big picture. Now let's talk about the answer choices that we can eliminate, because if you can eliminate answer choices right off the bat, then you have fewer to worry about, and you can really hone in on those ones and compare them side by side. So we're automatically going to eliminate B, because we already know this passage isn't meant to entertain. There's three types, major types of purposes. There's to inform, persuade, and entertain. And in no point of this passage was it to entertain. This was very much an informative passage. So we can get rid of that one altogether. So with what we have left, what comparisons are being made in those two sections? So the section from Marsh to Masterpiece, if you go back to that passage, you'll see that it talks all about Venice's history over the centuries by comparing how it overcame challenges between the 5th and 14th centuries. Okay, so then the next section, Then and Now, compares Venice today to the Venice that was overcoming challenges in the 1920s and 1960s. But the emphasis, see what we did there? What's the key word in option A, which is the correct answer? The emphasis was on transformation and triumph over the challenges throughout the years. And that's why A is the right answer. So, big takeaway here, know what the question is asking you and focus and hone in on what they're asking you. Don't be distracted or led astray by these answer choices that sound right, but they're focusing on another aspect of the passage, or they're asking you to look at the bigger picture of the passage when we're only supposed to be looking at this one part. Sometimes questions ask you about the whole passage, and sometimes it asks you about a specific part of the passage. The answer choices are written to trick you. That is why, if they didn't want to trick you, they would give you 3 obvious throwaways and then an easy one. They want to trick you. That's part of the game. Questions about the whole passage will have answer choices that only cover a part of the passage. Likewise, questions about a part of the passage will have answer choices that address the whole passage. Bottom line, know what the question is asking you and make sure the answer you choose matches up. Let's go on to 4. All right, 4. How do the phrases marvel of architecture and magnet for Renaissance arts in paragraph 8 contribute to the tone of the article? All right, so here we have a question about academic vocabulary. You probably, I hope, heard your English teacher mention tone throughout the school year, because that's an essential literary vocabulary word. So we have tone and mood. Those two go hand in hand. And tone is the author's tone of voice, and then mood belongs to the reader. My tone of voice puts you, the listener, in a certain mood. If you take a certain tone of voice with your friend or with your teacher or with your sibling or with your parent, whatever tone of voice you chose is going to put them in a certain mood. Okay, so with that in mind, tone is when we analyze what the author is trying to get across, what they want us to feel, what mood they want to put us in. And there's many different ways that you can convey tone. And here they're asking us to analyze the connection between tone and word choice. Because the author deliberately chose words like marvel of architecture and magnet for Renaissance arts. because the author wanted to provide a certain tone. They could have chosen any words, but they chose those words and those phrases. Marvel of architecture, magnet for Renaissance arts, because they wanted a certain tone to be conveyed. Tip: right-click on your test and use the highlight tool to identify your academic vocabulary in the question. Academic vocabulary means all the Englishy words you remember your teacher teaching you. So if you don't remember what tone is, use the dictionary tool that you have available to you on your digital test. And there will be multiple definitions of the word tone, but you want to find the one that matches reading and literature and everything that falls under that umbrella. You can also use the dictionary tool if you don't know what marvel means, or Renaissance, or architecture. So how did the phrases marvel of architecture and magnet for Renaissance arts in paragraph 8 contribute to the tone of the article? A, they highlight the author's skepticism about the cultural life of the city. B, they underscore the author's academic background and commitment to objectivity. C, they suggest the author's amazement and enthusiasm for the topic. D, they show that the author approaches this technical subject from a poetic standpoint. So, which of these choices best matches the tone of the whole article? The whole article, not just paragraph 8. We're looking at phrases from paragraph 8, but how do they contribute to the tone of the whole article? Pause the video, see if you can figure out the right answer, unpause it, and then we'll go to the next slide. All right, so the correct answer here is C. They suggest the author's amazement and enthusiasm for the topic. So which ones did we eliminate right away? We eliminated 2, and that's always good if you can eliminate 2, because then you can really compare the 2 remaining side by side to evaluate how they're different and which one is going to be ultimately the best choice. So we eliminated answer choice A. They highlight the author's skepticism about the cultural life of the city. And notice that I put the red X specifically over the word skepticism, because there's always one easy one to throw out, and that's this one. The author has never shown skepticism in the article at all. That's never been part of it. And if you don't know what skepticism means, remember, use the dictionary tool to your advantage. That is why it is there. Skepticism basically means that you have a hard time believing something, and the author has never suggested that at all. B, they underscore the author's academic background and commitment to objectivity. Okay, again, if we don't know what objectivity means, use the dictionary tool. Objectivity basically means facts. Subjective would mean an opinion. So the author's academic background is never mentioned. So that's there's no text evidence to support the author's academic background. But also, more so than that, the phrase marvel of architecture, which is the phrase that we are asked in this question to analyze, that phrase is subjective, not objective. To say a marvel of architecture, that is an opinion, it's not a fact. So to say the marvel of architecture does not show a commitment to objectivity, because that is the opposite. It's an opinion. Okay, so we eliminate A and B. So now we're left with C and D. So let's look at D. They show that the author approaches this technical subject from a poetic standpoint. And I have worked with kids that are preparing for STAAR, and they've used this practice test, and many of them have chosen this answer choice because of that word right there, poetic. And that's what they wanted you to be thrown off about. Because the word poetic is nice. Phrases like marvel of architecture and magnet for Renaissance arts, they do sound quite poetic. They are figurative phrases. Figurative language is poetic. Okay, so let's choose the poetic choice. But here's the thing. The test writers used the word poetic, knowing that some students would see that word and then immediately choose that answer. Those phrases sound poetic. Here's the word poetic. Boom, I'm choosing this answer. But be careful, because the question asks about the tone of the whole article. And the author does not use a poetic tone throughout the whole article. It's a very objective and factual tone. These phrases, while they are poetic, while they are figurative, they're thrown there, but they don't represent the tone of the whole article. Instead, we're left with C. Those phrases clearly show amazement and enthusiasm, because if you are not amazed about a topic, if you're not enthusiastic about a topic, then you're not going to use words like marvel or magnet for artists. Those phrases clearly show amazement and enthusiasm. And amazement and enthusiasm, it is a recurrent tone throughout the article. The article lists facts, and it is objective, but it presents those facts in a way that radiates enthusiasm and amazement. It doesn't radiate poetic throughout the article, because there's not a use of figurative language throughout the article. So hopefully that makes sense. Bottom line, don't rush to choose an answer because of one word. Don't see, oh, poetic, and just choose that because it sounds right. Make sure the answer you choose matches what the question is asking. So maybe you're seeing a pattern with all these questions. What is the question asking me? And how do I choose an answer that directly aligns with what the question is asking me? Because remember, we're thinking like test writers. There will always be an answer choice that sound really good. And it might be true and valid in another context, but it's not what the question is asking you to do. All right, we're over halfway there. Let's go to question 5. Remember what we kept saying about paying attention to what the question is asking, especially whether it's asking about a part of the text or the whole text? Okay, so let's look at this one. Which key idea about the inhabitants of Venice in the 1920s is supported by the details in paragraph 11? Okay, so details in paragraph 11. That's our focus, the details in paragraph 11. And you might have to, we'll read through these answer choices. You might have to pause this, scroll back to the text, and reread paragraph 11, and then scroll back here to this part of the video to find the right answer. A, they lacked knowledge of the newest technology. They depended on nearby cities for basic necessities. C, they did not understand why parts of the city began to flood. D, they needed to adapt to their environment. So what I want you to do as you pause this video and as you go back to the passage to review paragraph 11, I want you to work backwards. I want you to get this down to just 2 answer choices. Out of these 4 answer choices, which 2 are never suggested or implied anywhere in paragraph 11? Because that's what they're asking about, the details in paragraph 11. And after we eliminate those 2 that have nothing to do with paragraph 11, then we're able to choose the best answer. Okay, so pause the video, get to that point where you think you have the answer, and we'll go on to the next slide. Which key idea about the inhabitants of Venice in the 1920s is supported by the details in paragraph 11? Okay, hopefully you eliminated A and B, and let's see, if you didn't, let's break down the reason why, and hopefully you'll see why we eliminated those 2. And even if you did not get the correct answer, let's just focus on, did you eliminate the correct answers? Because remember, we're working backwards. We're thinking like a test writer. What wrong answers are they throwing at us, and are we going to be able to identify those wrong answers? Okay, so A, they lacked knowledge of the newest technology. So we eliminated that one, and I particularly put an X over those two words lacked knowledge because there's nothing in paragraph 11 that suggests that the people didn't have access to the newest technology of this time period. It doesn't mention technology at all in paragraph 11, unless you count the drills and pumps. If you count those as technology, then you have even the opposite. They did use those things. So if drills and pumps were the newest technology at the time, then they did have knowledge of the newest technology. So that one is easy to eliminate. Then we eliminate option B. They depended on nearby cities for basic necessities. Paragraph 11 doesn't say or hint that the people of Venice depended on nearby cities for basic necessities. The only necessity paragraph 11 even mentions is drinking water, and they got that themselves by drilling and pumping. No mention or implication of other cities involved. So A and B are not supported at all by paragraph 11. So we're left with C and D. So the correct answer is D. They needed to adapt to their environment. But some students might want to choose option C because it does use the same words from paragraph 11. So we told you to eliminate the two answer choices that had nothing to do with paragraph 11. And A and B didn't. But C does, to its credit, C does use the same words from paragraph 11. While it's true that paragraph 11 does say that parts of the city began to flood, it doesn't say or imply that they didn't understand why. In fact, it seems that they did indeed know why as soon as the flooding began. They figured it out. So yes, option C partly mentions details from paragraph 11, but it doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't imply that they didn't understand why. We're actually led to believe they did understand why. So this question ultimately is testing your ability to infer, which is an academic Englishy word that means make an educated guess based on clues from the passage. So even though the paragraph doesn't explicitly state they needed to adapt to their environment, which is the correct answer, D, paragraph 11 does state that the people in the 1920s needed water and that they drilled under Venice to get it. And that is an example of adapting to your environment. So we're using clues from the text to come to a reasonable guess. If they are needing water and drilling under Venice to get it, then that shows that, and we can infer that they needed to adapt to their environment. All right, let's go to 6. This question is asking you which quote best supports this idea, and we highlighted that idea. Which quotation from the article shows that the area that became Venice was a good place to take refuge from invaders? Okay, so we were told in the article that the area that became Venice was a good place to take refuge from invaders, meaning that people who were running from invaders would escape to Venice and hide out there. And that was ultimately the beginning of the city, is that people would hide out there, and eventually it became a city in its own right. But which quote supports that idea? So imagine someone is asking you, well, how do you know Venice was a good place to take refuge from invaders? Maybe someone's arguing with you and they just want to, or maybe they're genuinely asking you, how do you know Venice was a good place to take refuge from invaders? And if they asked you that, you would probably respond with something like, well, it's obvious because in the paragraph it says what? Which of these 4 quotes would you point out to that person arguing with you to prove your answer is correct? Pause the video, look at these 4 quotes, and fill in that blank. It's obvious because in the paragraph it says. So here's what was going through the minds of the people that write this test. What if we put the word refugee in an answer choice for a question that asks about taking refuge? They'll definitely pick this one, rubbing hands together, mwahahaha. And that's what they want. That's how they're trying to trick you. Which quotation from the article shows that the area that became Venice was a good place for taking refuge from invaders? Okay, so which ones are we going to eliminate right off the bat? We're eliminating A, because A says, instead of car-filled streets, the city of Venice in Italy has a system of winding canals. So this tidbit about cars is completely unrelated to hiding from invaders. It has nothing to do with hiding from invaders. It's just, it does not relate. Get rid of it. And there will always be one that has nothing to do with what the question is asking. Those are for the ones that people often choose when they haven't carefully read the article. So we're going to X that one out because we did carefully read the article and we know that this little sentence about cars has nothing to do with why people might seek refuge in Venice. We're also going to eliminate answer choice D. Even so, Venice's natural turned urban setting has special challenges. So this quote is referring to the challenges of Venice, but it doesn't say anything about helping with challenges, being invaded and needing refuge. So that one is also kind of unrelated because the question is, which quote from the article shows that the area that became Venice, this island that will one day become Venice, was a good place to hide from invaders? Well, just saying that its urban setting has special challenges, which it didn't even have an urban setting during the time that people were taking refuge, that has nothing to do with what the question's asking. Okay, so we're left with two answer choices, and answer choice C is looking really good because it uses the word refugees, and the question is asking about taking refuge, so many students will see that and pick it, and that's what they want. That's how they get you. So let's look at C. Although many of the refugees eventually returned to the mainland, some people remained on the islands. Okay, but you're not falling for their tricks. Yeah, just because it says refuge doesn't mean that's the right answer. That's just explaining that some refugees did indeed stay on the island after the fact. After they were no longer under threat of invaders, they stayed on the island. But it doesn't explain why they took refuge there in the first place. Why did they choose that particular location to take refuge? Answer B says that the islands were uninhabited, meaning no people lived there. So, of course, they will choose an uninhabited place to hide. So that's why B is the correct answer. But hang in there with me because I have another slide on this question. I don't know what any of those words mean. I don't know what uninhabited means. So how was I supposed to make the connection that if an island is uninhabited, that people will take refuge there? Make the most of every resource they let you use. They give you a dictionary right here on the test. At the top, there's a little icon that says dictionary, and when you click it, you can type in words like uninhabited and it'll give you that definition. And then you can read that definition and read that it says that there was no people living there. Oh, they're hiding in a place where there's no invaders because there's no one living there at all. Okay, so use the most of your resources. Question 7. Almost there. Based on the article, what can the reader infer about Venice's geography? And there's our academic word. We covered this in another question. We're going to reiterate it here right now. An inference is the hypothesis of reading. If you remember from science class, a hypothesis is an educated guess, right? So in English, in reading, it's the same thing. You're making an educated guess based on evidence from the text, evidence from what you read. So based on the article, what can we infer about Venice's geography? And I want to just say again, an inference is not going to be word for word from the text. That's why it's an inference. You're using clues from the text to come to your own conclusion. This plus this must logically equal this conclusion. So what can the reader infer about Venice's geography? Tidal effects have remained relatively constant over the history of the city. B, flooding in the city can be predicted by the Mose system. C, the location provided unexpected opportunities for developing the city. D, the boundaries of the city will continue to shrink. Okay, be careful. Before we go on to the next slide, before you pause to consider these answer choices, I want to ask you to be careful because this question is specifically asking about Venice's geography. So the geography means the physical location. So let's eliminate any answer choices that have nothing to do with geography, that have nothing to do with its landscape, with its terrain, with its physical location in the earth. And once you do that, we can decide on the best answer. Okay, so you can keep that in mind. Geography, pause, and when you think you have the right answer, unpause. All right, so which answer choices did we get rid of? A, tidal effects have remained relatively constant over the history of the city. Option A does not refer to geography, but about tidal effects, which is more of a scientific concept. There might be some overlap with geography, but it's not specifically geography. Not only that, though, but the information in paragraphs 12 through 14 actually contradicts what A is saying. So A is saying that the tidal effects have remained constant over the history of the city. But if you go back in the passage and reread the information in paragraphs 12 through 14, it actually says that humans have come up with ways to combat tidal effects over the years. So always remember that there will be answer choices that actually are contradicted by the passage, and that is testing you on whether you read the passage. So if it takes you 1, 2, or 3 times to read the passage, read it until you understand it, annotate it, because there will be questions that try to trick you by giving you wording that is factually incorrect. We also eliminated answer choice B. Flooding in the city can be, what is that word? Let me remind myself. Predicted. Flooding in the city can be predicted by the Mose system. The Mose system has nothing to do with geography. That might be a true statement according to the passage, but the passage is asking about what the reader can infer about Venice's geography. All right, so let's look at C and D. C talks about the location, and D talks about the boundaries of the city. So both of those are geographical terms. But the correct answer is C. So hopefully you did narrow it down to C and D, which are 2 answer choices that refer to geography, location, and place. However, answer D makes a statement that, according to the text, is untrue. Like I said, there will be answer choices that are just contradicted. They're untrue according to the what you read. And so that's why you have to make sure you read the passage carefully, because they will try to trick you by giving you answer choices that are contradicted by the text. The author suggests that the city will actually stop shrinking due to the Mose system. Option D says the city will continue to shrink. That is not true, so D cannot be right. Therefore, the best answer is C. Throughout the passage, the author talks about how Venice's location, geography, created lots of challenges that gave citizens opportunities to be creative. All right, so now we are on our last question of this text set based on this passage about Venice, but we're going to spend a little bit more time on this question than the other ones, and here's why. When I see, and even me as a teacher, as a college graduate, I can see this question and see all of these words And my brain immediately shuts down because those are just too many words for one question and one page. Okay, but we're not going to freak out. We're going to take a deep breath and we're going to break it down. Let's not look at the answer choices yet. Let's just look at what the question is asking us. Which of these is the best summary of the article? So this question is asking us it's testing our knowledge of how to write a good summary based on all this information that we were given throughout this whole passage. What is a good summary? It's normal to shut down in the face of information overload. It's part of our natural fight, flight, or fawn response. And 4 answer choices that look like back-to-back massive chunks of text is information overload. So then let's break it down. The test writers are testing your ability to understand what the concept of a summary is. Because by choosing the right summary, you are proving that you comprehend or understood the passage. And at its bare bones, this is a reading comprehension test. So what is a summary? A summary is simply this: a brief restatement of the main points. A summary of an informational text includes all of the main points from beginning to end of the passage. And that's how those test writers, that's how they try to trick you. By giving you answer choices that only cover a part, not the whole passage. And that's been a recurring theme throughout all of these questions. Are they asking me about the whole, or are they asking me about this one part? And it really comes to play when you have these summary questions. Best advice with the summary questions is to take them one at a time. Don't look at the others. Don't look at B, C, or D. Look at A. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to take it one at a time. A, which of these is the best summary of the article? A, Venice is a beautiful city with famous artwork on display almost everywhere. This includes the Santa Maria della Salute Church and numerous other buildings, especially the palaces that were built by wealthy inhabitants when the city was at its height. Today, it is a popular destination for tourists who come from all over the world to see its canal and sit at the cafes. Okay, so option A talks a lot about the artwork of the city and how the city's art and architecture make it a popular tourist spot. The passage does talk about those things, but only in one section. It's not what the whole passage is about. The whole passage is not focused on the art and artwork of the city. It mentions it in one section, but this is a hyperfixation on something that is only a small part of the whole passage. Option A, Okay, so it's not A. Let's look at B. Let's try B. B, Venice is a beautiful city with unique geography. Built on a network of islands, it has at least 150 canals. Early inhabitants constructed buildings atop wooden stakes, including grand palaces and marble churches during the Renaissance. These stakes lasted hundreds of years because of chemical transformations under the water. Nevertheless, the city still floods regularly. Okay, so unlike option A, which hyperfixated on the artwork part of the article, which is only a small part, unlike option A, this one does a good job of covering the whole article. It mentions the main points that we're stating in the beginning, middle, and end. Seems legit. One problem: that last line. Paragraph 13 clearly states that the city is not still flooding regularly. And a summary can't have information that contradicts the passage. The test writers might have been hoping you didn't read and therefore didn't catch that detail, or maybe they were hoping that you rushed through the answer choices and didn't catch that little tidbit. But we are 2 steps ahead of them because we know now, because we are inserting ourselves in the minds of test writers. And we know that they are going to put in answer choices or pieces of answer choices that contradict, that go against facts that were given to us in the article. The answer choices can never contradict what was clearly stated in the article. And that's part of reading comprehension. And that's what they're testing you on. Did you read? And not only did you read, but did you understand? Did you pick up on things? And can you find the inaccuracies? There's an inaccuracy here. So therefore, option B, fine. Let's try C. Venice is a World Heritage Site celebrated for its architecture. Located on 118 islands, the city is organized around waterways or canals. The island had weak silt and sand that would not support large buildings, so stakes had to be pounded down to reach solid clay for building to begin. Okay, option C does not have any incorrect information. That's good. Everything is verified by the passage as legit. It checks out factually. And it covers a good bit about what was talked about in the original passage. It doesn't hyper fixate on just one part of the passage like A did with the focus on the art. It covers more than one part of the passage. But it feels like something is missing. What's the meaning of a summary again? A summary has to restate all of the main points. So what were the main points of this passage? And are they all mentioned here? Unfortunately, a huge portion of the passage talked about the flooding challenges of Venice and how they deal with that problem today. But that's not mentioned here at all. So we can't have a summary that leaves out such an important and crucial part of the passage. It's like we have the first main point and the second main point, but we've left out this other huge component of the article, and that can't be a summary. Therefore, option C. Well, at this point, there's only one left. If this one doesn't make sense, we write it down because I don't know what we're going to do if this one doesn't make sense. Option D, Venice is sometimes called the floating city. Instead of streets, it has more than 100 canals. The buildings, many from the Renaissance, are supported on wooden stakes driven deep into the clay below the surface. In order to preserve this historic city from flooding, engineers over time have developed creative solutions, a process that continues to this day. Okay, well, we have learned two things from this exercise and these summary questions, that they will give us factually incorrect information in some of the answer choices, and that they will give us answer choices that do not cover all of the main points of the article. But in this case, all of the information listed in D is factually correct according to the original passage. Nothing contradicts. And the main points of the whole article are covered. The network of canals, main point, the history, main point, and the challenges in the more modern day to overcome flooding, both then and now. Main point, main point, main point. It checks out. Option D is correct. So long story long, on the summary questions, look out for those two things. Factually incorrect information. Wrong answer choice if it has factually incorrect information, and wrong answer choice if it doesn't encompass the whole passage. So I want to conclude by just reminding you that taking any standardized test, whether it's the STAAR test or later in your high school career when you get ready for preparing for college, if that is something that you're going to do, the SAT, the ACT, those college entrance exams, if you're in any AP classes, the AP test, all of these standardized tests, they are written by humans. And they have a pattern. They have a pattern of the types of wrong answers they throw in. And that pattern is going to vary depending on the type of test. But ultimately, the trick to excelling at any standardized test is like playing a game of chess. Know their next move and beat them at their own game. If you liked this video, like it, subscribe, because there's going to be more videos just like this coming up in the coming days and weeks. We're going to cover different sections of the STAAR test. We're going to cover the SAT, the ACT, the AP test. If you have a request for a type of test that you want covered, let me know in the comments, because that's what I do. I deconstruct these tests by looking at what the test writers, how they're going to try to trick you, and how we can combat that and beat them at their own game. So until next time, I hope you enjoyed the video.